Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today, and welcome to Combining Data Integrity and Process Validation, What You Need to Know for Success. A couple housekeeping things to get us started. First off, we are so glad that you've made time for this. We hope it's informative. We're going to take time for questions after the presentation and answer as many questions as we can. You should see on your menu a questions section. And at any time during the presentation, you can ask a question within there. If you have tech issues, we'll help you out as much as possible. That would be the place to let us know if you can't hear or what have you. But any subject matter questions, please put them in there and we will answer them at the end of the presentation. You should also see a chat function within your menu for GoToMeeting, and you can use that. Regina's going to be asking some questions and looking for feedback and some brainstorming. So make sure to check that out. She'll let you know when that part of the presentation comes in, but I just wanted you guys to be aware of that. And finally, everyone will receive a copy of the webinar tomorrow later on in the afternoon. So if you have to jump out early, that's fine. Or if you end up coming in late, same thing. So thank you again so much for being here. I'd like to introduce Regina, and give me one moment. Regina Fullen is the VP of our RAQA Consulting at Compliance Team. She assists in the medical device and pharmaceutical industries to help them achieve ever-increasing compliance to regulations in the pharmaceutical, medical device, and related industries. Within her role at Compliance Team, Regina also uses her writing skills to publish relevant and meaningful articles and do wonderful presentations, informational webinars like this. She is always on top of current regulatory changes, industry trends, and helping companies to improve their product quality and their processes. She comes with quite the list of certifications, including CQE, CQA, and Certified Manager of Quality Organizational Excellence with ASQ. So we are so glad to have Regina as part of our team and here to present today. Again, let us know if you have any questions by typing in the questions menu. And without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Regina.
Thank you, Val. I am so happy that you gave me such a fantastic introduction. Yeah, so we should move on and talk about our course objectives. So for this, we just want to see that, first I want to point out that there are congruencies, not similarities, but congruencies. They support each other between process validation and data integrity. And then we're going to talk about the stage 1, stage 2, stage 3 process validation life cycle and discuss how data integrity integrates with those. And then we're going to make a very strong case for doing really good data integrity up front in process validation so you can have a cost-saving process validation program that improves your business performance rather than a validation effort that is a drain on your company. So let's dig in. I love the puppies. That's Val's touch. We'll move on. So first we need to understand what data integrity is and what process validation is. So first, data integrity. Data integrity is talking about the wholeness, the completeness, the consistency, the accuracy of the data, which is attributable. That means you know who made that entry and when they did it. All your crossouts are documented. It's legible, so you can read what it says. There's no ambiguity. You aren't using whiteout to cross out things. You want to actually see what got crossed out. Contemporaneous. Okay, so that's a big word, just basically saying, you know when somebody did something. So you know that nobody did anything, nobody signed something before it happened, or guessed at when it might have happened several days after. That's original, or what they say, or true copy. So it's either the original piece of documentation that existed, or you have a true copy, meaning, for instance, let's say you were in the laboratory, you documented something, and then you spilled acid all over it. Maybe you were able to quickly make a photocopy of it, or were able to somehow make some kind of true copy of it to verify that it is in fact the same information that got destroyed in the lab. And then accurate, meaning measure twice, cut once. Calculations need to be verified by a second person before going to the next step. You don't want to be measuring once, cutting, and then realizing that you added the wrong amount of reagent to your information. So we also need then, that's data integrity. Now, validation is all about, consistency. We see a consistency between process validation and data integrity, in consistency with both. And that we have objective evidence that your data are accurate. In other words, the question in both that process validation and in integrity is my information here believable? And that might sound like a strict concept, like, oh, everything has to be crossed out, and it has to be crossed out so the original information is still visible and all that. But it's because if you're an FDA inspector and you're walking into a company and evaluating this stuff, how are they supposed to know whether you made up a bunch of data and gave it to them, or if they can actually rely on it as something that's truthful? I mean, they have no idea whether what they're looking at is fraudulent or truthful. So the bar now becomes not whether something is truthful or fraudulent, but whether you've created a system to make it so that anything that is untrue is clearly flagged and evident. And the FDA does understand that there are honest, well-meaning errors. That's very different than deliberate fraud. So all of this goes into when the FDA goes to evaluate your validation records. And the FDA has created a process validation guidance that divides validation into 3 different stages. Stage 1, which is the pre-validation setup. So this is the work that you're doing up front for your process characterization. If you do this work sloppily and you do not use good documentation practices and data integrity, guess what? You can't use any of that information to support your validation. So do it right the first time. And now, if you do that, then your process 2, or your stage 2 and stage 3 processes are a lot easier. Your stage 2 is what most people call validation. But remember, the FDA considers this process development work part of the validation as well. So stage 2 is your process qualification. That's your typical IQ, OQ, PQ, process validation, test method validation, cleaning validation, all that stuff. But step 1 is part of the validation in the view of the FDA. So you want to have your data integrity up there. And then finally, there's stage 3 validation, which is an understanding that the validation life cycle is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process that needs to be sustained. You have you have some kind of process monitoring protocols, periodic validation reviews, annual product reviews. All those things play into there, and as well as you need to look at your product surveillance or your pharmacovigilance data that supports your stage 1, stage 2, and stage 3. You have SPC monitoring. So those things will tell you whether your process is in control. And that is what validation is really all about, is showing that you have a controlled process. So we're going to talk a little bit about this IQ, OQ stuff, because your PQ or your process validation or whatever is a capstone in the roof, but your IQ and OQ answer the different questions about, for instance, IQ says, does your infrastructure support the necessary production and process controls so you can have a process that's under control? And the OQ will answer whether you have the equipment, systems, facilities, utilities, software that are suitable for use. So the PQ is based on those IQ, OQ prerequisites. And here are the different things that you would consider in an IQ, OQ. Again, the IQ part, which should be identified somewhat up front in your process characterization. For an IQ, it might be as simple as looking at the vendor's installation documents and verifying there, maybe in real time, because sometimes people who work for a instrument company or something like that don't really understand data integrity, but having somebody work with that person as they're doing the installation stuff so that you can leverage that information up front. And then maybe some of these steps will be no longer needed during your validation, because you've already shown a lot of these items to be working. And the same thing for OQ, where there may be instrument checks and calibrations and things that are done by the installing company that verify a lot of these things. And OQ is basically saying, does the system work? But when we get to validation, we're actually asking, does this system work for me? Which is an entirely different question. I mean, something very similar like this. So people say, oh, you will save so much money with a Costco membership. Well, I tried it for 1 year and it didn't work for me. I ended up not saving as much as my membership fee, so I let it go. It's a solution that may work for many people, but may not work for you. So how do you determine whether a validated system or whether it's going to work for you? Well, you want to stay practical. What do I really need? And be practical, thinking from the customer's perspective. What are the implied things that a customer may want out of this process? What is the customer willing to pay for is a common thing that that people who do SIPROC would be looking at. Use science. Well, you have a process characterization stage, so you should be able to figure out what's critical from that, so that you can only focus on those things and not have to worry about myriad other factors that are noise. And then act risk-based. So look at the things that are going to keep you awake at night. So this is now a time where I would like to have you guys open the chat and try to suggest some examples of the types of things that you would be doing to stay practical, to be science-based, to be risk-based. And then I will share that with all the participants here. Any of your ideas are welcome. I want to hear your ideas.
Gina, as they're typing those, we did have a question come in, and before we get too much further in the presentation, I thought this would just be a good time
A
to
good
answer.
time.
They're putting their
Sure.
chat in. Is IQ, OQ needed if PQ is completed successfully? Couldn't a valid PQ?
You do not want to proceed to a PQ until you've done your IQ, OQ. Again, the IQ, OQ says, do I have an infrastructure in place that can support this? If you haven't answered that, you have a possibility for a lot of variation because you don't have a system. And OQ is answering, does this system work? Does this equipment work? Does this facility, utility, does this software work? I mean, that's a very basic question. Does it work? Before you can say PQ, does it work for me? Can I use the infrastructure that I have and leverage a successful result? If you haven't answered that, you can see that in the future, you might have done a PQ and not verified that you had an SOP that is in place. So somebody's going to go and change the method on you, and all of a sudden your process falls out of control because you didn't satisfy the prerequisites. So I suggest that possibly this person may have incorporated the IQ and OQ elements in their PQ, and they actually had a full process validation in there. If they're saying, but we already covered that, then what we really need to think about is breaking those things up into IQ items, OQ items, and PQ items, because you don't want to do a PQ without satisfying the fact that you have an IQ and OQ already in place. So now I'm going to go see if I can answer, look at anybody's ideas that we have here.
We did have someone, if you look under questions, there's.
Oh, they put under questions. Okay, let me see. So I'm trying to pull this
Michelle
up.
typed it, and
Wow. I'm able to see one line at a time in there. If it's really, see if there's a way for me to hover over it and drag it so it's wider. No. Are you able to read it for me, Val?
perform risk assessments and challenge testing for critical processes.
Absolutely, absolutely. We do. We want to do some testing up front, and you want to do it in the stage 1 portion of the validation. The earlier you can move an activity to up front, the less work you have to do further downstream. So, and what you want to do is you want to do it in terms of, avoiding having to do firefighting. So, we look at this: long smoldering issues, fires to put out, ashes to sift through. We don't work in hell, at least we don't want to. Now, some of us think our jobs are in hell. I don't want to work that way. We want to be responsible validation scientists. We want to leave our production departments with a feasible process that when we do tech transfer, we don't need to spend hours and hours and hours making sure that the product goes out the door compliant. We're not going to test quality in, we're going to build quality in and make it so that it's so that we can go home on time. And so, yeah, we just want to be thorough, but not exhaustive. Because validation has undergone this big paradigm shift, because before we used to just have IQ, OQ, PQ, and we're done. And now we're realizing that it's part of a life cycle. You have to do your process characterization all the way through continued process verification. So We don't want to assess all our systems and processes the same. We want to look at the risk of that system to the overall and validate just that. So, if it's processed water, it's going to be very different than water for injection, for instance. We don't want to have a lot of validation documentation. Instead, what we want to do is we want to do the short confirmatory IQ, OQ, PQ, and we let the well-documented integral data that's collected during the process characterization phase to do most of the talking. We want to move from solving problems just prior to launch to solving the problems up front and planning appropriately so that you don't have the problems at launch. And that validation isn't a one-time thing, it's an ongoing thing. It's a way of life, but it doesn't have to be a lot of work because it's already being done for you continually. And that it's not just a process that's within the plant. We also now have process control in the supply chain. And this is becoming more and more important these days because we have so many supply chain problems. For instance, in the medical device field, you not only need to validate the product, you need to validate the product's packaging. You need to validate that the product is going to stay integral on its way to the customer and potentially back. And that is a validated process. Validation is also not an art. It is a science. It's based on sound statistics and engineering principles. So saying that, oh yeah, this sounds good. Well, sounding good is, not good enough. We want to understand that it's good. And in fact, what I'm going to say is that we used to grow up in the theory that you needed 3 validation runs, like, one's luck, 2 is, okay, maybe there's something here, and 3, you're showing your process is repeatable. But isn't that just a, arbitrary number? It's like saying it's the 3 little pigs. Well, you saw the first one had to run away from his house, and the second one had to run away, and then the third one said, I have a big brick house and you can't blow me down. Well, it's just enough to establish some kind of pattern, but it's not a statistically valid rationale. What's better is that in your process characterization, you understand what your errors are, and that you may not even need to run 3 validation runs. If you have a good process characterization that says, I know exactly what my chances are of getting valid product are. And I will take an example from my past. So I did in vitro diagnostics in the past, and we were trying to do validations, and we were trying to do things saying, okay, well, this factor is 95%. We know not with 95% confidence that we can make a good calibrator. And we know with 95% confidence that we can make a good probe, and we have with 95% confidence we can, all the different kit components of this IVD. We had 95% confidence for each component. But if you have 95% confidence for each component of your kit of being able to make something, does that mean that you have 95% confidence that your kit is going to perform? No. And why? Because if you take all those different errors and you add them together, and here's my certified quality engineer coming out of me here, is that if you take these to 95% confidence, and then you take that over 3 validation runs with 15 critical quality attributes, at 95% confidence, you are now only at maybe 10% confidence the whole thing matrix together is actually going to work. Is that a high degree of confidence? I know I've done the math for you. It's kind of a pain in the butt to do all this math. But no, because I don't know about you, but I don't think 10% confidence that your whole kit is going to work together is very high. So we need to have a little more confidence in it, and that means we have to work backward from that 95% confidence, which is, by the way, 1 in 20 will fail, is what 95% confidence means. It means you have a 5% failure rate. So you want to even drive that even lower. But let's say you're going to target saying, I think it's an acceptable level of failure to fail 1 in every 20 batches. So for that, you need 99.67% to achieve a 95% confidence if you have 15 different variables you're trying to matrix together. And that means that your process capability to be greater than 1, we need to make sure that there's this 1.67. Process capability is your measure of success, of being able to stay within your specifications. So graphically, what it looks like is you have assuming that we have 15 different rings, and we're all trying to get inside this hole. That all of the factors need to somehow be within this hole. We're gonna pass this way with maybe only 5% error around here, whereas this one we're seeing that there's 95% error if you're drawing a theoretical circle that's somewhere around here. So in this case, we have the zone where the validation passes 95% versus 10%. And all that is waste. So that's costly to have a poorly validated process where you didn't do a good characterization up front. And then using risk assessments. So, you can leverage your vendor's test documents, like all those IQ, OQ things. I already discussed that. And then you can use this site acceptance test and factory acceptance tests. And then you can use your DOEs that are done up front for identifying the critical attributes. Maybe you do some kind of a screening design first to identify what's critical. And then after taking that screening design, then you can just mess with the factors that were identified as critical and determine to what extent they are, and be able to plug those into your risk assessment for your validation up front. But what is critical? Okay, so I have this little thermometer here where there's no risk. Well, that's fantasy. We know that there's no process that has no risk. But there are lots of things with low risk that we could probably risk assess out, or things where the benefits outweigh the risk. Then you have some moderate risk, high risk, and then of course the most critical risk. So what's critical? Okay, so your customers are not going to want you to have to recall their product. They're not going to have trust in your company anymore. So that would be number 1, prevent recalls. We want to make sure that the process is predictable, it works. Again, there's a data integrity element there that we know that it works. So you would do some kind of risk assessment maybe, and looking at those different, what could happen, why would it fail here, and then determine based on that risk assessment, like an FMEA, that you could do this. You have to consider things like software. Software can introduce a lot of risk, but it can also save you a lot. So if software changes, you may need to do some revalidation because, you mess with a program here, it could affect something over there. And we want to do some independent review of all that data to make sure that there's no conflicts of interest. And we'll get into some non-examples here of areas where there were conflicts of interest where the FDA said, this isn't going to go. But essentially, though, it's up to your organization to define these things critically, do things correctly, and consider what could happen and whether there are already safeguards in place that protect against that. And maybe there are sufficient safeguards already in place. You may already have procedures that you don't need to change. They're already in use. But in the end, if we do the validation and we do it correctly, it should save your organization money. Why? Because if something's predictably successful, there's no running around and you know, trying to fix things. We don't have complaints. We don't have to have extra staff. There's no turnover. Nobody wants to leave their jobs. Can we say that data integrity saves money too? Well, I think so. And here is another opportunity here for us to brainstorm other ways that data integrity or failure to validate could introduce waste, that MUDA that I highlighted there. But here I said is, okay, you have, you know, validation or product failure, system suitability problems. Well, if you don't, you know, in a test method, you're supposed to do some kind of system suitability test. If you can't ever get your system suitability to work, maybe you didn't design that test method very well. And of course, then you'd need to repeat work. You have to do investigations and deviations, and those take a long time. And if you're in a situation where your company has a pipeline that they're trying to fill, or they don't want to go on back order, there's going to be a push to try to close those investigations and deviations out as quickly as possible so you can ship the darn product. But the problem is that when you do things for being quick, you may not be thorough. Then, you know, there's scrap, there's rework, there's recalls. You got to discipline employees. Oh, you know, I think that a lot of us have worked in organizations where if the product wasn't coming out as it should be, the answer was to discipline the technician who did it wrong. But there may have been other factors, and I'll actually bring one in later here. And then, of course, you have this audit risk. And this is where I'm going to talk a little more about audit risk, especially associated with validation and poor data integrity. So this first one, where there was an HMI. So an HMI, of course, is the interface that you use on the screen to operate a piece of equipment that would be used for manufacturing. And the HMI records said that the equipment wasn't working, but there was a batch record saying that the product was made. Now, I could see why the FDA would be strongly skeptical that anything, you know, happened here. Again, data integrity. Well, does it work or doesn't it? Did you do an OQ that shows that it works? Did you do a PQ that shows that it works? How did you manage to make a product with non-operational equipment? And then this next one, I mean, now I don't want to throw the operators under the bus. It could very well be that their managers gave them bad training. But in this case, it looks like the operator didn't clean the equipment, put a clean sticker on it, and the FDA came by and saw, what are these stains on the equipment? and they swabbed it, and sure enough, it was drug residue. I don't know. I mean, seems like where is the cleaning validation? Okay, it's non-dedicated equipment, fine, but where's the cleaning validation then? So either they didn't do a good cleaning validation, and that's why there was drug residue, or they didn't, or they have poor data integrity. Okay, so in this example, and this is a long one, but it's basically that a lab data system allowed data to be deleted. And suppose that this deleted data was the data that was needed to support a process validation, saying that the product met specifications. Oh, how do you know that? I mean, would this be even a recall? I mean, we could say that there's, you know, a whole bunch of computerized records that are being uncontrolled. Is it fraud? Well, maybe it's not fraud. Maybe we have some very, very, very good technicians who always are truthful in their records. But maybe there's one bad apple. Maybe there's one manager who likes to change data. We don't know. We won't know. And so how would you even respond to this warning letter item? I mean, would you have to recall things and basically say, we don't believe anything in here. We don't believe that any of our product went out well. So this is one that's really troubling. This one I think is interesting. So this is about a media fill. So a media fill, for those of you who don't know, is where you take media and you fill it into vials. And the purpose of this media, its growth medium for microbes, is to verify whether your filling equipment can fill sterile product. And in this case, they found growth, but they decided to just throw away that data and then say, oh, well, that one turned turbid, so that one's not valid. We're gonna replace it with a different fill. This can kill somebody. So, and media fill is a validation technique, but you know, they didn't even verify what the root cause of the failure was. It would be fine, for instance, if they found that the vials themselves weren't sterile, and so that was what was happening, and the fill was working fine or whatever, but they didn't even do an investigation according to this. And then the next one is one where QA didn't review the validation data. Now, if you are a truthful validation scientist and you are employing data integrity, it shouldn't matter who reads your documentation. They can read it, that's fine. You can share the data. Who cares? It's the truth stands for itself. But in this case, another one, it was a sterile drug processing situation, and they just basically said, yes, this validation passed, and there was no scrutiny against the data at all. I don't know. And I think that a lot of this has to do with a rush to market. So people are traditionally, pharmaceutical medical device companies have been very eager to leave the early stages of process development so they can rush to market, without recognizing that those early stages are an investment that makes those other subsequent stages, the stage 2 and specifically validation efforts a lot easier. And I understand it. There is it's a balancing act. I mean, I've heard this, cheap, fast, or good. Choose two. So if you want it good and you want it cheap, then you're going to do it slow. If you want to be first to market, maybe you get a little bit scared by seeing that your competitor is faster at developing for instance, a new COVID test than you. But it's about worrying about your own stuff. You know what? I'm not going to worry about them because they could be rushing to market and they might not have anything that's any good. We're going to do it right. We're going to do it well. So we want to eliminate the cost of rework. We want to invest in R&D budget upfront with well-documented data and confidence in your process, meaning get to know your statisticians. And we don't want any of those reworks, recalls, returns, refunds, remediations, nothing. We don't want any of those things. We're going to design it right the first time. So I'm going to discuss some of the things in stage one. The first thing is being open and collaborative. Two heads are better than one. The next thing is begin with the end in mind. Figure out how do you think this is going to work, and then bring people on board for it. And you want to get to your statistician so you can design a truly stable process. And you might want to consider standardizing your studies. In other words, meaning that you have an SOP that says this is how this type of study is done. So it's designed so that you follow the procedure and it's done properly. Electronic lab notebooks, very, very useful because experiments in there are traceable. You can make them Part 11 compliant, so you have the data integrity there. And you can leverage information from other projects or other experiments to support your own things, or at least to hypothesize how something might work for your process, because you have readily available an archive of experiments that are already there. And work with your engineers so you can get your scale-up studies done earlier in the development process, because sometimes, for instance, the scale-up doesn't really match what you really have. So let's say you've done a bench scale in a beaker, or maybe even a carboy, but now you want to scale up to a tank. Well, a tank is made of stainless steel. Your beaker is made of glass. Does that have an impact? What about the surface area to volume ratio? Well, your tank is going to have unless you have some kind of surface in there, your surface area to volume may impact things. So you want to develop some kind of scale-up study up front. And so you also want to look at what your engineers can build for you for your process to make sure that when you scale up, there's actually equipment that's capable of doing that. And at stage two, it might be useful to use electronic means to do your calculations, do some validation on that, because we want to satisfy that accurate requirement in ALCOA. We are flawed human beings. Validated automated calculations can save time and money. You don't have to waste time with people cross-checking errors. In fact, there have been times when I worked in an area where the calculation error was done incorrectly, and then the verifier verified the calculation and got the same result because we were both doing the calculation incorrectly. So that's important. We want to make sure that we have the right that we are having good calculations, even in human errors. Do not do a full PPQ covering all the process variables. That's a waste of time. Discern that critical from the non-critical. And understand your CPK, your process capability, and your yield. Because sometimes if you see that happen, you know something's going wrong. And I'll give an example here. So there was a process. It was kind of a bench scale kind of process, and the manufacturing document said place sterile cotton in the mouth of the vessel and allow the product to mature, whatever they were doing, if they were putting in an incubator or whatever. I don't, that part. And they were always getting some very consistent yields from that process. Well, they brought in a new person, and the person was following the SOP. And when that person performed the process, the yield was like tenfold what the original yield was. And they said, whoa, what's going on? As it turns out, the technique of how much cotton to put in that mouth of that vessel was strongly dependent. And the process required oxygen to get to the tank. And the first person would really plug that vessel with, you know, a lot of cotton. And the new person was not packing it in as tight, hence the tenfold increase in yield. Well, it was a validated process. There was nothing in there. Nobody had known that the amount of cotton put into into the mouth of a vessel would affect the yield. So those kinds of studies need to be up front. Like, okay, well, that you can't really measure that. Well, you can, but nobody did. So just understand that CPK and your yield. And that was something that could have been found out way up front. And at stage 3, what I'm going to say is don't wait to implement your plan for stage 3 validation until like, oh, it's been 3 years. Well, we should probably do. No. You put the plan in place up front. The sooner you implement the plan, the better your data integrity. The reason why is because it doesn't look like you're cherry picking which data you're going to use to make your process validation pass. You're putting the criteria up front. It's unambiguous. There's no question that you chose criteria that make sense for your process. And use a validated program again for the SPC process to verify your process capability. If you can data mine from your existing systems, if you have a TrackWise system, if you have a computerized system, again, you're identifying exactly where we're going to get the data from, and you're not going to cherry pick it. Which is an interesting thing, because this morning I was listening to BBC News this morning, and those studies with ivermectin, turns out it's all cherry-picked data, or a lot of them were cherry-picked data, or data that was copy and pasted, or data that may have been made up. They could tell there was a data integrity error in those studies. You don't want to be caught with that kind of a thing with the FDA looking. And then finally, pharmacovigilance data, product surveillance data, collecting the data you get from customer feedback that goes into stage 3 is really useful. Maybe it's an inconvenience, because sometimes the customers find things that you didn't consider as a specification when you first embarked on this project, because there are implied specifications that the customer has that maybe you never anticipated. But that doesn't mean that your product is a bad product. It means that you failed to anticipate a customer specification, and it means that maybe there is some kind of process requirement that you need to go back and refine your process validation to fulfill. So a summary of the concepts we've discussed is, can I believe this? Can I believe this data? Is there something in there? Well, in this case with the ivermectin study, he said that about half of the data points ended in 8. And he said the statistical possibility of that happening in any one study is really remote. So he saw that there was copy and pasting. So can I believe this data? Well, that's kind of, the first step in data integrity. Statistics will save you money. Yes, statisticians are highly paid professionals. They aren't cheap, but it will save you money in the long run. And so will just having good scientific integrity and sitting down and talking to somebody else and not having a silo of knowledge, hoarding that knowledge so that other people can't participate in the process. You want to fail early, meaning you want to put everything into the stage 1 as early as possible. You don't want to rush. You want to get it done right the first time. Then you can do stage 2. It's going to be a little bit harder, but when you get to stage 3, you have a well-controlled process that you have to go back very infrequently and tweak. Use the technology wisely. Keep with a good continuous process verification plan and keep your customer in mind all the time. The critical aspects are what the customer wants to pay for. And now I will take questions.
Thank you, Regina, for that awesome presentation. And I apologize. At some point, I was writing some notes and I realized I wasn't on mute and I was erasing. So if I disturbed any of the presentation, I apologize. I happened to look up and realize I didn't remute myself. Okay, very good, very good. I'm like, no, that was not the best time to use the eraser to my paper. Well, I thank you so much, everyone, again, for taking time with us. If you haven't yet, go ahead and pop a question into the question box. We would love to answer as many questions as we can. And just a reminder, we will be sending out a copy of this webinar to all the attendees later tomorrow afternoon. That email should be going out, so be sure to look out for that. A little bit while we're waiting for questions to come in, a little note on compliance team and who we are. Regina is on staff here at compliance team and is always happy to answer your questions and work with clients. So we are a life science consulting company. We work in clinical research, pharmaceutical, medical devices. Our compliance consultants work to bring life-saving products to market. By teaming up with our trusted experts, your company gains the confidence that your medical product design, clinical research operations, manufacturing, and validation processes meet FDA regulatory and compliance standards at every stage of development. So that is compliance team in a nutshell. If any of that sounds of interest or a partnership opportunity for you, please visit us online at complianceteamllc.com. That is complianceteamllc.com. You can there schedule a meeting to talk with one of our experts, check out more about our services, and you can also check out our compliance resources library, which we are constantly adding to. Most of those resources, I think actually all of them, are free, by the way. So definitely check out our compliance resources tab on the complianceteamllc.com website. All right, so taking a look here, believe it or not, Regina, unless I'm missing something, I do think that we might not have any questions. That's a first, I think. Well, I take that back.
Well, we did have a question.
We
Yes.
did have one pop in there earlier in the presentation. How does engineering runs help PQ protocol? I hope I said that correctly.
How do engineering runs help a PQ protocol? Okay, so what you would be doing in your engineering runs is, in those cases, you're going to be, they might be DOE type of tests, where you're looking at whether you can repeatedly create a process, or you can also, you would be using that along with a statistician to identify your process capability and such. And depending on those engineering runs, you will have a very good idea of what your process capability is already. And you can then leverage that information so that when you're doing your PQ, you may already know what your failure rate is, or what your pass rate is, and how predictable your process already is. At that point, you may have sufficient data already, assuming that it was done with good data integrity. You may have sufficient data already that you could do, theoretically, one PQ run, just to show that it works, nothing more. Now, you have to have done good engineering runs at first, and they have to be well documented with data integrity. But you could get away with, theoretically, under the new FDA process validation guidance, one PQ run. That's it. That's a big savings.
Excellent, excellent. Great answer. And let's see here. Someone has mentioned they're already cited for one PQ run. That doesn't quite seem like a question, but Ahmad will definitely reach out to you afterwards. And I know Regina would be happy to talk with you a little bit more about that. We actually have another question coming in here as I speak. What are the best ways to introduce the statistical tools in the validation study? Where should we start? We have commercial processes running, and some new projects are coming for validation.
Okay, so what I think that, what's very helpful is that it may be useful upfront, like I said, consider standard processes. So you might even want to have an SOP on, this is how we're going to do our standard pre-validation studies, and create them, get the SOP vetted by a qualified statistician, so it can tell you, how are you going to do a screening design? How are you going to do confirmatory design? How are you going to take that information and input it into a risk assessment? Those types of things then become automatic, and you've invested the time up front with a qualified statistician in developing the procedure, and now it's just a matter of doing it. And you might have to go back to the statistician and have them crunch the data, because you have decided you've done the procedure, and you may not be able to do all the calculations and such with it, but at least you have a documented process. You do that as early as you can in the development project. You don't want to wait till after the fact. I mean, after a product's already launched, you've pretty much you've finalized the manufacturing process. What you're trying to do is trying to identify what the manufacturing process should be at early stages.
Awesome question. Thank you for that question. I'm gonna say it's last call.
Well, I thought I saw another, let me see if I can see. I thought there was me being another one here, but it's very hard for me to find it.
Here, I think there was one at the very beginning. We answered
It's
that one.
perform risk assessments and challenge. Oh, okay, that was
Yeah.
just Michelle's comment.
Yeah,
Right.
I think that means I always take it when there's not a lot of questions at the end that you've covered everything you could possibly cover. I guess that's a compliment to the presenter. Again, thank you guys so much for attending today and for taking the time to join us. We will be having more of these sessions, so make sure to be on our mailing list. Make sure to check out complianceteamllc.com. You can also sign up for the mailing list there. And those who are on our mailing list get first opportunity to sign up for these sort of opportunities. We do not charge for these webinars that we do about quarterly, but we do give first opportunity to those on our mailing list. So make sure you get on those. We do sell out of a couple, I shouldn't say sell out because we don't charge, but we do fill up from time to time. So it's not something you can jump on if you're not on our mailing list. Again, we hope to see you all very soon. Have a wonderful day. Thank you, Regina, and we'll see you all soon.
And thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it.